Power scaling is meant to be a simple concept. Someone is stronger than someone else, therefore they should beat them in a fight. For example, Homelander is stronger than Captain America, therefore Homelander should win. But what if it's Homelander versus Superman? Suddenly, it's far more difficult to pick. Sometimes power scaling is rather nonsense, because we're talking about fictional characters. They can be as strong as a writer wants them to be. Or sometimes they can be inexplicably weak. Most of the time, it's just a bit of fun, not to be taken too seriously. The Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's work in general has not been spared from this. Recently, I've been seeing a lot of the who would win or power scale subreddits, and like I said before, it's all just a bit of fun. Of course, characters from Middle-earth get brought up quite often, and to be fair, there's definitely some pro-Tolkien bias going on, which warms my heart. I say this because I've seen Lord of the Rings characters or creatures get stacked up against something else many times, and the thread largely says that the Lord of the Rings character will win. Unfortunately, in many instances, I think that the thread is overestimating the strength of the Lord of the Rings character. Famously, or infamously, George R.R. Martin said that Jaime Lannister would beat Aragorn in a fight, arguing that Jaime's plate armor would be the difference. This is obviously controversial. Sure, Jaime Lannister having plate armor is an advantage, but every other advantage would be Aragorn's. He's taller, stronger, faster, has more endurance, has more experience, especially in actual combat, and while not exactly superhuman, he is still harder to kill. I think it's fair enough to say that at least 9 times out of 10, Aragorn would beat Jaime Lannister in a fight. But if we're going by how Tolkien's universe was crafted, then this isn't a guarantee. You see, like many other fictional universes, people often ask about power scaling in Middle-earth. As before, would example 1 beat example 2? Sometimes it is obvious, right? Glorfindel will beat a random orc, but would Glorfindel beat a Balrog? Maybe, maybe not. It would probably be a tie where they both somehow fall to their deaths, but Balrogs have wings, surely it would just fly, right? But when it isn't obvious, fans of Tolkien's work will often say, you can't really apply power scaling to his work. And to be fair, you do see this on those aforementioned subreddits. So why shouldn't we power scale Lord of the Rings? Well, firstly, Tolkien didn't give it much thought himself, or any thought at all, really. But secondly, power in Middle-earth is a rather abstract concept, and it isn't interchangeable with might. A great example are the Sons of Denethor. Boromir has great martial skill, and when he is brought down, it requires many arrows, when a lesser man may have been killed by just one. Now, in a martial contest, Boromir might be expected to take down his brother, Faramir, but is he more powerful than Faramir? Because Faramir had the power to do the one thing that Boromir could not. He rejected the One Ring, when it was right there for the taking. That requires an incredible amount of inner strength and willpower. So, who has the greater power here? And as for might, just because example A is, on paper, more powerful than example B, this doesn't mean example A is going to beat example B in a fight, because how do we measure might? What counts and what doesn't? This is demonstrated constantly throughout Tolkien's work, from the gods themselves to regular mortal men. For example, Morgoth was originally the most powerful of the Valar, capable of contesting all of the others at the same time. But what do these contests actually consist of? Because when Tulkas arrives on Arda, Morgoth runs away from him. Even though Morgoth is more powerful than Tulkas, even though Morgoth has a much greater ability to affect Arda than Tulkas, on a physical level, he doesn't think he can match him, and later events prove him correct. Later on, after Morgoth has expended much of his power, he's only barely able to defeat Fingolfin, who to be fair is described as one of, if not the greatest fighter of all time. But despite being physically quite weak at this point, Morgoth is still quite powerful. He's creating new creatures, he has vast armies that are held together by his will, he's placing curses on people, and he's creating plagues. So how do you define power here? Because if Fingolfin almost beat Morgoth, then presumably Superman would easily beat Morgoth. But would you still say that Superman is more powerful than Morgoth? Another great example is Sauron. He's the second Dark Lord, evidently also extremely powerful. He's one of the greatest craftsmen who ever lived. He has the power of domination, he can corrupt the world around him, he's a master of necromancy, and he can induce terror in his opponents. His physical presence is a big deal. When he attacked Tol Sirion in the First Age, his terrifying sorcery was so great that the defenders simply fled. And afterwards, when he was sent to hunt Barahir's outlaws in Dorthonion, He turned the forests into awful, hostile places. He also defeated Finrod Felagund in what could be described as a magical rap battle. Yet despite this, Sauron doesn't have a good record in physical fights. When he fights Huan in the First Age, he loses and is lucky to escape with his life. During the Second Age, Sauron watched as his forces are destroyed by the Númenóreans at the Battle of the Gwarflo. He's unable to do anything, and he can do nothing except flee as fast as he can. And later on, during the final showdown of the War of the Last Alliance, he is mortally wounded and then dies after fighting Elendil and Gil-galad, although he does manage to kill both of them in the process. Obviously, Elendil and Gil-galad are no bums, but they certainly aren't the most dangerous fighters to have ever walked Middle-earth. So once again, we have a character who would be considered a world-ending threat, yet they've been beaten multiple times in conventional fights by people who shouldn't even be close to them. Moving away from literal gods, we also have someone like Luthien, who comes across as insanely powerful at some points, but also a damsel in distress at others. She could create magical disguises, she has healing powers, she could cast enchantments on people to make them wary or put them asleep. She does this to both Sauron and Morgoth. And she even destroyed Sauron's fortress with her magic. Perhaps her greatest achievement was making Mandos feel pity, because that guy normally feels nothing. Yet despite this long list of achievements, on 2 separate occasions, she's helpless against Celegorm and Curufin, and has to be saved by other people. They are both powerful warriors, but are they then more powerful than Sauron or Morgoth? Of course not. I could probably spend an hour giving different individual examples. Beren is described as a one-man army when he's being hunted by Morgoth's servants, yet he later spends most of the tale of Beren and Luthien getting saved by Luthien and Huan. Glaurung is originally Morgoth's greatest weapon, capable of laying waste to armies, yet he gets ambushed and killed in a single stab by Turin. Smaug sacks Erebor, killing countless dwarves, yet he gets shot down by Bard, who's just a normal dude, and the Black Arrow is just a normal arrow. Gothmog, Lord of Balrog, slays Feanor and Fingon, 2 kings of the Noldor. How does he die? Well, Icthelion headbutts him with a spiked helmet and then tackles him into a fountain where they both drown. Trolls are incredibly dangerous enemies, yet Pippin manages to kill one at the Battle of the Black Gate after it has already knocked down Beregond, who in theory should be a much greater warrior than Pippin. Saruman gets his throat cut by his own servant, who was a broken down mess at that point. Perhaps the most famous example would be the Witch King, Sauron's most capable servant for thousands of years, yet he gets killed by a woman and a hobbit who had never fought in a battle before. These apparent inconsistencies don't just apply to individuals, but also to groups and broader concepts. I just mentioned the Witch King. Well, the Nazgul are incredibly dangerous. They're sorcerers who have an aura of terror that can literally kill someone. Yet Tolkien also says that if you aren't afraid of the Nazgul, then they actually aren't that dangerous if you're a capable warrior, but very few people are unafraid of them. In Nature of Middle-earth, Tolkien says that elves can sometimes make such quick movements that men can't even track them. Going by this logic, elves should always be better fighters than men, simply based on their speed and reaction time. Yet we have 3 examples of men beating elves in fights. Turin easily disarms Saeros, Tuor defeats Maeglin and tosses him from the walls of Gondolin, and Beren tackles Curufin to the ground and is about to choke him out. We also have other examples of men who were clearly better fighters than most elves. But what about comparing the Númenóreans at their peak to the ancient heroes of the Edain in the First Age? Who was mightier, Elendil or Turin? On paper, it should be Elendil. He's almost 8 feet tall, he has 300 plus years of experience, and he helped kill a literal demigod. Compared to that, Turin is tall, but presumably nowhere near that height, and he's a man in his 30s, not empowered by Númenórean blessings. Yet in the Children of Hurin, Turin comes across as almost unkillable. Enemies flee at the sight of him, he withstands dragonfire. He walks into the hall of an Easterling chief by himself, literally picks the man up like a child, and kills him by throwing him across a table. So I ask again, who would win this fight? Alright, I hope by now you've realised that power scaling in Middle-earth isn't simple. There aren't really power tiers, there isn't an easy scissors, paper, rock counter system. People who are powerful in some ways aren't really that powerful in other ways. And some people who are powerful do lose to people who aren't, at least on paper, anywhere close to them. Because it's really difficult to accurately gauge how powerful a character in Middle-earth actually is, it's then quite difficult to compare them to characters from other universes. For example, if Sauron were to fight Homelander, physical strength alone would suggest Homelander would win. Maybe, we don't know for sure. But even then, would he? Because Homelander is unbelievably mentally fragile, meaning there's a good chance Sauron would easily be able to mentally dominate him. Your next question might be, why? Why is the power scaling in Tolkien's universe all over the place? Isn't this just bad world building? Well, no, not really, because Tolkien is fairly consistent when it comes to why certain characters are dangerous. Morgoth and Sauron are dangerous because they can easily gather vast hordes of evil creatures and have huge impacts on the world around them, even at a metaphysical level. They're not dangerous because they're both going to walk out and physically kill everyone themselves. The Nazgul are dangerous because they have an aura of terror that causes people to freeze or even become ill and die, and orcs are dangerous because of their cunning and numbers. But he quite clearly demonstrates where all of these people or creatures have weaknesses. Morgoth is a massive coward who gradually expended most of his own strength. Sauron was more of a talker than a fighter and was later constantly beset by his own doubts. The Nazgul have a whole list of weaknesses, and orcs aren't really great fighters at the individual level. This is quite different to, say, having a villain who is effectively presented as invincible in an entire story, only to have them be rather ineffective in the final fight without good reason. But as for the why, I'd say there's three major reasons. One is that even though Middle-earth is high fantasy, it's rather grounded in the way things work. Magic is kept rather vague and exists more so as something that is interwoven into the fabric of things rather than people hurling fireballs at each other. Because the world is more grounded, it means things often play out in a more mundane way. When Turin kills Glaurung, he doesn't have an epic showdown with the dragon. He waits in a ravine, and as the dragon goes over the top of him, he stabs him. Another example is the death of Isildur. He's a mighty warrior that's over 7 feet tall, yet he has a rather undignified death. As he climbs out of the river, he gets shot in the throat and heart by orcs, and dies instantly. The second reason is the secret hand that guides, fate. Fate is just a huge thing in Tolkien's world, and at times it probably allows for characters to be far stronger than what they usually are. Finrod watches werewolves devour all of his companions, helpless to do anything, yet when it's Beron's turn, he suddenly has the strength to break his bonds and beat a werewolf to death with his bare hands. When Isildur steals a sapling of the White Tree of Numenor, he is grievously wounded, and he seems like he might die. But when the first leaf appears on the new sapling, he suddenly heals. And speaking of this one and several others, there's probably another reason. That some events have been embellished in the telling. Was Beron truly a one-man army in Dorthonion? Maybe, but how does anyone truly know? He was the only one there. The final, really important reason is that in Middle-earth, to be evil is to be weak. That's not to say that evil people and creatures can't do great damage, but it is to say that they can't perform the same deeds that good people can. They can't be heroic, they can't be selfless, they can't do things that shouldn't be possible because their own evil holds them back. Whether this is Morgoth or Sauron becoming physically weaker over time, or whether it's the Witch King letting the One Ring slip through his hands because of his cowardice, or Smaug getting killed because of his pride. What this means in terms of power scaling is that while evil characters may appear powerful on paper, in practice they will ultimately harm themselves, a concept that isn't as popular in other media. So going back to the original example of Jaime Lannister versus Aragorn. Yes, Aragorn has most of the advantages, and yes, you could reliably expect him to win. I wouldn't bet against him. But events in Middle-earth prove constantly that they who is the biggest and baddest doesn't always win. Next time you see someone ask who would win, insert character from Middle-earth or insert character from other universe, just remember that it's really hard to say a lot of the time, to the point of where it's kind of a pointless question. If someone from the MCU fought Luthien, sure, they're likely physically much stronger than her, but who's to say she doesn't just put them to sleep somehow? If she could do it to Morgoth, she should be able to do it to almost anyone. But then, she didn't do it to Celegorm and Curufin. Was that because she didn't want to? Or was it because she couldn't? Yeah, who knows? See, this is the exact problem. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. I thought of this video because I started getting recommended the who would win and power scaling subreddits. Entertaining places, but my god, there's a lot of confidently incorrect people spreading misinformation. Turns out, there are still Lord of the Rings fans who think the Witch King had a magical barrier protecting him from being killed by a man. Oh well, at least he's spreading misinformation about something that doesn't really matter, as opposed to something that does, which is a minor inconvenience that will ultimately doom civilization. Anyway, cheers, farewell, and remember, Old Man Willow almost killed Merry, so by that logic, it would also kill the Witch King. Yes, not so cool when you're killed by a tree, are you?